Hello and welcome along to Applied Education's Terminations DVD. My name is Brett Thornett, your presenter. Let's start by having a look at exactly what's covered in this DVD. The first chapter is dealing with terminations law. So in terms of the law that covers termination, it's mainly the Fair Work Act and the provisions and the requirements to give notice that we'll be looking at in this chapter. From there, Chapter 2 is looking at just normal terminations. So how you cater for leave on termination of employment. And there's actually three ways that leave can be paid now. I'm talking mainly about annual leave here. And that is, you've got continuing leave, you've got cash outs of leave, and most importantly in this DVD, the leave on termination of employment. From there, we'll have a look at the other ways that termination can be made, the tax consequences and the payment summary consequences. Chapter 3 is dealing with employment termination payments. So what we firstly need to do is have a look at what comprises an employment termination payment, what is an ETP, what is not an ETP, and importantly, we need to examine the tax consequences and also the fact that it's taxed concessionally. There's a separate ETP payment summary which needs to be issued within 14 days of making that payment. From here, we look at the death of an employee, how it's taxed, and if there's a death benefit ETP. Next, we've got disability or invalidity of an employment. And finally, we've got genuine redundancy and approved early retirement schemes. Chapter 1 is dealing with terminations law. In relation to terminations law under the Fair Work Act, an employer cannot terminate an employee unless they've given them written notice of their day of termination. In terms of giving them that notice, it must be given to them in one of three ways: delivered to them personally, leaving it at the employee's last known address, or sending it by prepaid post. In terms of the amount of notice that must be given, if the employee has been with you for less than 1 year, it's 1 week. Between 1 and 3 years, it's 2 weeks. 3 to 5, it's 3 weeks, and more than 5 years, it's 4 weeks. Actually, one thing that I haven't put on this slide is the fact that if your employee is aged over 45 and they've had at least 2 years of continuous service, the over 45s must be given 1 extra week. Now, sometimes it's not practical for your employees to work out this notice period, and if they don't work out the notice period, then they must be paid out in lieu of that notice period. And by the way, if they are paid out in lieu of notice, that would be classified as an ETP, and we covered that in later chapters. Also under the Fair Work Act, there's also the requirement that an employee is paid out a redundancy. So in terms of what a redundancy actually is, a redundancy is where the employment is terminated, where the position of the employee no longer exists. So that job is no longer required to be done by anyone. It would also apply if the employer became insolvent or bankrupt. So where a redundancy exists, then the payout is in accordance with this slide here. If the employee has not been with you for 1 year, there is no redundancy. From there, between 1 and 2 years, the payout would be 4 weeks. Between 2 and 3, it's 6 weeks. Between 3 and 4, it's 7 weeks. And you can see there it keeps on increasing until you hit 9, but less than 10 years. At that stage, it's 16 weeks. And then from whatever reason, once you've hit that 10-year mark, it goes down to 12 weeks. perhaps at that point the employee would be due long service leave. Now, there's two important exclusions from the requirement to pay out a redundancy. One I've already mentioned, and that is if the employee has been with you for less than a year. But the other one would be if you employ fewer than 15 employees. That's based on a simple headcount, by the way. Fewer than 15 employees, there is no requirement to pay redundancy. Also, redundancies wouldn't be a requirement if you're employing certain ad hoc casuals. Also, if you've got employees under contract. A lot of contract employees, the termination date is actually built into the original agreement. Where a dismissal is possible, you would also need to be mindful of unfair dismissal laws, which are part of the Fair Work Act. Rather than talking about unfair dismissal, I'd prefer to talk about fair dismissal. And on the Fair Work Australia website, you can actually download the Small Business Fair Dismissal Code. And, well, actually this code only applies to small business employers, namely if you are employing fewer than 15 employees, but it is worth looking at across the board regardless of the number of employees that you employ. But in terms of what is fair and unfair dismissal, there are certain circumstances where it is fair to dismiss somebody immediately. Where it's fair to dismiss somebody immediately would be serious misconduct, and this is referred to as summary dismissal. So this would relate to things like theft, fraud, violence, threatened or actual. As long as it's sufficiently serious, then that would be grounds for immediate dismissal. Other areas where dismissal would be fair would be, say, a redundancy. But in other cases, you really would need to be mindful to ensure that it's fair. Now, on this screen, I've got the first part of the Small Business Fair Dismissal Code checklist, and it's just asking you if you've got under 15 or more than 15 employees. So if you employ under 15 employees, the qualifying period for unfair dismissal is 12 months. More than 15 employees, then the qualifying period goes down to 6 months. You would think within this time frame you'd be able to establish whether or not the employee is capable of doing their job. The next question on the checklist is working out if the employee has in fact been employed on a full-time, part-time or regular casual for 12 months or more. Just note that this slide says regular casuals. So if you've employed a casual regularly for more than 12 months, they also can be unfairly dismissed. The next question on the checklist refers to genuine redundancy. In other words, if you didn't require the person's job to be done anymore by anyone because of changes in operational requirements of the business. So it might mean closure of division, reduction in of output. I guess the GFC excuse is getting slightly old now, but if you're not replacing them with another person, the redundancy is genuine and it would be deemed a fair dismissal, as long as you've considered redeployment and you've complied with your awards and all agreements. The next question applies to what's referred to as summary dismissal. So you dismiss them on the grounds that the employee was stealing money or goods from the business, the employee defrauded the business, the employee threatened yourself or other employees with violence or actually carried out the violence, or any serious breaches of occupational health and safety. For example, they failed a drug test or they arrived at work under the influence of alcohol or drugs. that would be a serious breach of OHS. So if it is a serious breach, well then obviously that's a grounds for immediate dismissal. Next, you've got other forms of serious misconduct. And with other serious misconduct, you just need to stipulate very clearly what the reason for the misconduct was. Where a dismissal is possible, your employee does have the right to have a support person present, as long as that person is not a lawyer acting in a professional capacity. And I guess this is probably more important if you're, say, dealing with a minor, somebody perhaps with a language barrier, or at some other disadvantage. So if it's requested, you should obviously agree to that request. Where it's perhaps the most difficult is where the reason for termination is unsatisfactory conduct, unsatisfactory performance, or capacity to do the job. In this section here, the key is the fairness to your employee. So the employee does need to be clearly warned, either verbally or in writing, that they're not doing their job properly and they'd have to improve conduct or performance, otherwise be dismissed. So it's probably preferable to do it in writing, and there is template letters available on the Fair Work website. If it's done verbally, perhaps then it would be wise to minute that meeting and have those present sign off on those minutes. Once the warning has been given, the next key thing is that the employee must be given a reasonable amount of time to improve conduct or performance. Perhaps also training could be offered, perhaps counselling, and then following that, if they don't subsequently improve, then they can be dismissed. The employee must be given the reason for the dismissal and an opportunity to respond. Also, you need to keep records of any warnings made and the discussions about performance. It's not like the old legislation where it required multiple warnings. With this system, it's just about the fairness. They must be given the reasons, they must be given the opportunity to respond, and then if they don't subsequently improve, that's when a dismissal can occur. And if you are following this checklist, it does mean that the chances of unfair dismissal are reduced accordingly. But if you do have to pay an unfair dismissal, that would be classified as an ETP, and I'll be covering off on ETPs in the next chapter. If there was another reason for dismissal, that reason would also need to be clearly documented as part of the code. The employee may also just voluntarily resign, or they may abandon their employment. But bear in mind that under the Fair Work Act, by law you must record the date of termination, the reason for that termination, and also the name of the person who acted on that termination. Now, with voluntary resignation, the base assumption is that your employee would provide you with the same amount of notice that you must provide your employee. This checklist is then just signed off and kept as a permanent record.